And what we're seeing, I think, is the acknowledgement of how tight those supply demand curves are, and we don't really have the bandwidth for a major disruption in supply today.
Welcome to an episode of Strategic Conversations. We host insightful discussions with top business leaders. Today, we are hosting Ms. Tracey Henderson, the Senior Vice President of Worldwide Exploration for Apache Corp. Ms. Henderson will be a speaker at the Houston Strategy Forum's upcoming Upstream Symposium, and we are really excited to host her. I am Ravi, the president of the Houston Strategy Forum and author of the management and leadership book, How Cohesive is Your Company, and author of the book, Happy Soul, Hungry Mind. Strategic Conversations is hosted by the Houston Strategy Forum. If you value these conversations, please hit like and subscribe to the Houston Strategy Forum's YouTube channel. Today's episode is sponsored by Cohegic, my management consulting and executive coaching firm. Thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward to a great discussion with Ms. Henderson. Ms. Tracey, thank you. Thank you for taking the time, ma'am, for joining us on the Strategic Conversation. We welcome you to this episode of Strategic Conversation.
Thank you, Ravi. Happy to be here.
Ma'am, there is a fortune cookie which says we live in interesting times. I think that saying is getting old now. I think we have been living in interesting times. We would like some boring times,
yeah,
especially in the oil and gas industry. But stepping away, I mean, even just today, oil prices are gyrating as the market tries to figure out all these factors about the Russia invasion of Ukraine, what OPEC Plus might do, what producers might do. But I want to ask you a question. If we step away from the current news and talk about the general supply-demand landscape, what has happened to the supply-demand landscape, and where is it? What do you see? What are the bigger trends? I see the Russia invasion of Ukraine as a spike. Hopefully, the war will be over soon, and so we'll continue to have these spikes, but there is an underlying dynamic that affects supply demand. So I'd love for you to share with us how you see the supply demand equation and what are the bigger trends there.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. Your fortune cookie analogy is really good. I think if I had to describe one thing, we're sort of, really fatigued by we live in interesting times because they've been overly interesting, probably the last 18 months. But I think it's been interesting to see the transition, as we saw where things went negative, sort of right around COVID when it started. And then we've recovered. And if you sort of have really tracked and listened to the supply demand curves, for the last probably 6 to 12 months, and recovery happening faster, I think, than what most people predicted. And, we had been having conversations with some of our counterparts here about how tight those supply demand curves were. Yes. And acknowledging that any disruption in supply actually had the potential to create, a spike or, sort of a super cycle, if you will.
Yes.
And so it's interesting that, when Russia happened, it's like suddenly that happened, overnight. And,
Yes.
You had a perceived disruption in supply. And, what we're seeing, I think, is the acknowledgement of how tight those supply demand curves are. And we don't really have the bandwidth for a major disruption in supply today.
Yes, you're absolutely right, ma'am. And you talked about demand. I know 18 months ago, all these analysts who are very smart people, very well educated, who work really hard, many of them, including the Economist magazine, was predicting the end of the oil and gas era because they predicted that demand will never come back.
Yeah.
And we look at where demand is based on whose analysis, but they're all close, where they have now acknowledged that demand is already higher or close, definitely, to pre-pandemic levels.
Right.
So
Yes.
the demand has come back, and there is still more demand to come. I know this summer, nobody is going to be in their home. Everybody is going to be on the road traveling, either by air or by in their vehicles, but everyone is looking to go out for a vacation. And so that demand is coming. I was just talking to a major company yesterday, and they said their executives are back to traveling every day of the week now. So travel, business travel is back, leisure travel will be back. And my wife, I didn't get to read this article. She shared this, that in an article that many executives who have been going into the office and their teams were not there are beginning to feel lonely. So they're asking their teams to now come back. All of that demand is still going to come on top of where we are already. So demand is very robust, but supply, as we look at supply, we're trying to scratch our heads. Where is this supply going to come from? Because you look at the US, we are still 2 million barrels lower than we were in 2019. Right now, in spite of oil having recovered last year and this year, we're still 2 million barrels short just in the US. OPEC has. So then the question is, the supply demand is really tight. How does this supply demand really come back into balance? Because we are inventories all over the world, global inventories of oil are lower, multi-year lows, going back, I guess more than 10 years, I need to write. And you look at that and you look at spare capacity. So we need supply. Where is this supply? Where should we go knocking? Should we go to the US onshore? Should we go to the offshore? Should we go to OPEC? Where do we need to go to balance the market?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think, if you just think about, well, we just need to increase supply, we need to add, it's not an easy thing to do. I think you would struggle to get a lot of the OPEC countries to say, okay, you need to produce X number of barrels more a day, because a lot of them are going, flat out at capacity today. And the sort of the limiting factor is not actually, in some places, the rocks or the ability to produce. It is, right now we're in the middle of a supply chain. What I would say is a supply chain crisis today, given that we can't get things moving as quickly as we need to. So the limiting factor, even, you mentioned the onshore US, is the ability to bring out additional rigs and crews and frac crews and resource them to drill more wells. And that is really, the one place that we're seeing an issue is on the human and the supply side chain on being able to do it. And offshore is similar. I mean, the rig market for the offshore drilling is very, very tight today. And a lot of these, what we're seeing, I think, is the impact of, standing down a lot of crews and cold stacking a lot of rigs, both onshore and offshore. And the ability to bring those back out is not really flipping a switch. And, the companies that the rig companies, they want to see long-term commitments to be able to make the investment to bring these rigs and these crews and put these crews together and the rigs out of cold stack. And with the volatility that we're seeing, that's not helping. I mean, as you mentioned today, we fell, considerably just on the news, be some increase in supply, of which everyone in the industry knows that that's not going to happen tomorrow, next week, or probably next month. It takes time. And so I think we're in a bit of a paradox right now, because we need to get more capacity to drill, yet they want to see sort of stability in the market, commitments from the companies to get comfort to bring those out and put them back in the market.
Yeah, great point. And you're right. Oil fell today. Today is March 9th in the morning by, I think, close to 20% in a matter of minutes, because of news that OPEC might consider increasing production to replace Russian barrels, and oil corrected. And so any oil and gas executives who's looking at that, any strategic team who's looking at that will pause and say, what do we trust where oil prices are? Is this a mirage, right? And we'll get caught off guard if we start increasing capex and then we find oil decides or has a fit one morning and then goes lower, right? So how do we bring stability to this market? I think your point about supply chain is absolutely right. Two major oil and gas executives shared yesterday that supply chain is a real problem. And even if they decided to start increasing production more than what they have forecasted or what they have planned for, that new barrels of oil will take at least 8 to 12 months before they show up.
Right.
Yeah. And those, I think they didn't say it. My view is those are optimistic projections.
I think so. If you track the rig markets in either place, and getting new wells drilled to boost production, it's a real challenge.
And ma'am, we hosted what we call one of the most powerful supply chain symposiums we hosted in February at the Houston Strategy Forum. And I had never heard this word in business and in my 30 years of corporate career, right? The word that was thrown around on the stage was patience, that we want to take time. And in my career, I've never dared go into my boss and say, please have patience, because I'd be waiting patiently outside the HR office as I was preparing for my exit interview, right? Patience is never a word that I would have dared to use, but they used that. They said, we have the whole, and we had owner operator heads of supply chain, and we had service company heads of supply chain, mega companies there. And everybody was of the consensus that this is going to take time, that for us to respond is going to be challenging. And to your point, everyone is waiting on investment and clear and decisive investment to happen. But that is not happening because the market is not able to decide where oil prices should be there. I mean, it seems a very tricky marketplace.
Yes. Yeah. And I think you raised something earlier that was interesting, which was, there were sort of naysayers early on that said, oil, the demand that we saw prior to COVID will never come back. I heard other statements that, we'll never see $100 oil again.
Yes.
And but there were a few of the analysts out there that were saying, if you track what you think is going to happen at a human level, once COVID starts to clear, they were actually predicting more very, fast, exponential growth, just based on the fact that, people had been really cooped up, had not been traveling. And then suddenly as things start to open up, people got out and started doing things very, very quickly. And I think we did see that, so you started to see, what I would say is a faster recovery, which sort of imposed some volatility if you're trying to predict future oil prices. And then you've had, what's happened with Russia, which has introduced, even much more volatility. And you don't know if it's going to be short cycle, medium cycle, or long cycle volatility.
Yes.
Today, we don't see a path forward on how it's going to get resolved. If it's a long, protracted conflict, and the Russian, production is sanctioned, we could be in the supply crunch for a period of time. But if you're trying to make investment, you also have to balance that it could get resolved in a month. And so I understand the patience word. I mean, to me, it is, they need to see stability to be able to start making investments to increase their capacity.
Yes. But one thing is clear, is that we are going to need more supply.
Yes.
I think if the oil and gas industry doesn't produce more supply, then this pendulum is going to swing more to the extreme, right? And so that's not healthy for the industry, because if oil prices really reach extreme levels, then society will pull back and will create demand destruction, which is not going to be healthy. So which are the lowest hanging fruit to generate supply in the short term? And then in the midterm, where do we go to find supply? Where should the industry focus? if you are the strategy maker for the industry, right? And we have all the industry executives in the room, what should we tell them?
So I think about it really in sort of three different buckets, if you will. That, you know, we've got the capacity, I think, you know, to grow, to be able to get more production the fastest out of places like the onshore US, out of proven areas that are in the Gulf of Mexico where you could drill more appraisal wells and more production wells. But you've got to fix the supply chain issue, you know, to get the rigs out there to do it. But it's just saying an unconstrained world. I think, you know, that's one place that you could turn things on, you know, and get things on at a much shorter cycle. But even then, as you said, so, you know, we are seeing continued demand growth. So I think you've got to, you know, be able to get the things that you can do on short cycle as quickly as you can. There's stuff that I would say is sort of more medium cycle, which would be places like the Gulf of Mexico, ILX, you know, low hanging fruit that you can tie back to existing facilities, which won't be as fast as onshore US, for example, but still, you know, a shorter cycle time than some of the, you know, the bigger things that will be coming on. And then the last bucket would be, you know, where in the world are you seeing longer cycle things, which would be Guyana, Suriname, some of the big discoveries that they've just had in Namibia that will be, you know, that are fairly sizable, that could bring on, you know, pretty good tranches of supply. It's just they're going to be longer cycle. But I think, you know, we are, you know, certainly as I am coming to the reality that, you know, the demand is not going to suddenly fall off, you know, 5 years, 7 years. And so, you know, while we will be looking at how the world is going to transition to renewables, you know, fossil fuels are going to need to be here for a, you know, in my view, an extended period of time as we transition. And those new sources of supply that are going to be fairly critical. So, you know, the things that we're working today, like the Surinames, the Guianas, and the Namibias, you know, will be a source of new supply, but it'll be 5, 6, 7 years out, if you will. But that will, you know, sort of address, if you looked at the entire demand curve. Like I said, I think you need all three of those buckets running still.
Yes. No, great point. And ma'am, thank you again for being part of our conference, the Upstream Symposium that's coming up on April 6th. And the theme is preparing for the super cycle. Everything that we have discussed today that you have shared, it's clear that a super cycle is forming if it's not already here. And so we love to, we're looking forward to hosting you and getting more detailed into the discussion and ask some questions that are really probing and discuss all of that. Ma'am, why should someone take the time to come attend this symposium on April 6th?
Oh, I think it's going to be a great opportunity to hear from, you know, I'll exclude myself, but I think some great speakers, having seen some of the folks that are on there that I think I'm most excited to hear from. You know, as you said, we're living in really interesting times and sort of all looking through a crystal ball or a lens right now, trying to figure where things go next. And I think, you know, there's a lot of experience that will be in the room and a lot of, you know, voices that, you know, you can discuss and see what they think as well in terms of how things are ultimately going to evolve over time. But so I think it's just a great opportunity to get some of the leaders in the industry tell you, you know, what they think. And because things are, as you said, very interesting today, the conversations will no doubt be interesting as well.
Yes. And we don't know what is going to happen between now and April 6th. So we look forward to seeing you all on April 6th at the Upstream Symposium at the Houston Strategy Forum. Hope to see you all. I want to thank Ms. Henderson for taking the time today. Thank you, ma'am. Enjoyed this discussion and things are only going to get more interesting. So.
Exactly. All right. Thank you, Ravi. Appreciate it.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
All right.